A few days ago, somebody emailed me wanting to know what the difference was between MTH's Railking line of products and their Premier line. And that's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to show you what the differences are between these two lines and why there's a price difference between the two. To represent the Railking line, we're going to use this Conrail SD60. And then for the Premier line, we're going to use this Canadian National SD70. From a functionality standpoint, you're not going to find much difference between the Railking line and the Premier line. Both engines have two motors, and they're both equipped with proto-sounds too, so they have the same sounds and the same digital functionality. And that's one of the nice things about MTH, is that even if you spend a little less money and get the Railking line, you're still getting the same digital command system as in the top-notch Premier line. The main differences between these two product lines are typically going to be the size of the engine or car, the detailing on the engine or car, or some of the auxiliary functions such as smoke units and lights and so forth. Looking at this Railking engine first, let's talk about size. Not all Railking engines are built to scale, which means they're a little smaller than they should be, and they're not quite as realistic looking because of this. Now, this is not necessarily a bad thing. The reason they make most of the Railking items smaller is so that they can negotiate tight turns that are typical on a small toy-like layout. So they're just catering to a certain audience when they make these things a little smaller. They're catering more towards the classic toy enthusiast who wants something that can go around an 027 layout without any problems. Now, some Railking items are built to scale, like this engine here is pretty close to scale. And usually in the description for the item they will tell you if it's scale or not, but by and large most of them are not scale. Next, let's look at some of the detailing on this Railking engine. I'm going to start with the side frame on the truck. You'll notice that the detailing is all molded in. There's no separately applied detailing on these side frames. The same thing is true for the rest of the engine. Most of the detailing is going to be molded in. If you look here, the steps are molded in. The door on this side is not a movable door, it's molded into the plastic. The sand caps are molded in. The windshield wipers on the windows are molded in. The walkway here, instead of having the separately applied safety tread like a Premier engine would, it's just smooth black plastic here. The rear view mirrors on the engine are molded in as well. On the steps, instead of having those little holes like a real engine would, it's just solid plastic there. There's no coupler cut bar applied to the front of the pilot. The MU hoses behind this plow are molded in. And on the fuel tank, there's no separately applied paint for the cap and the gauge or anything like that. So the basic keyword when you're talking about the detailing on any Railking item is going to be molded in. Most of the detailing is not going to be separately applied. It's going to be molded into the body to save costs. Now, that doesn't mean there will be no separately applied detailing. On this engine, for example, we've got these screens that are see-through that have been put on. The fans up here have separately applied fan blades, and on the ends we've even got these nice little chains here. So there are some separately applied details, but you can't count on them with the Railking line. Sometimes they're on there, sometimes they're not. It's not a guarantee. Lastly, let's talk about some of the auxiliary features on this engine. Those include the smoke unit and some of the lighting features. On a Railking engine, none of those features are necessarily guaranteed. Sometimes you will get a smoke unit, sometimes you won't. This particular engine does have a smoke unit. And by and large, most Railking engines do have a smoke unit, but some don't. You have to check the specs on the engine that you're buying. And with lighting, sometimes you'll get marker lights and ditch lights, sometimes you won't. It's not a guarantee, so again, you need to check the specs. So to summarize the Railking line, it's a product line that's geared more towards cost consciousness and towards people who are not looking for a super realistic model. In other words, people who want more play value out of a train than realistic prototypical looks. Now let's take a look at this Premier line diesel. When you buy anything from the Premier line, be it a diesel engine like this one, a steam engine, or a piece of rolling stock, you know that you're getting the best that MTH has to offer at the time that the item was built. Let's talk about size first. When you buy any Premier line item, you're going to notice that typically it's going to be larger than any Railking item, and that's because all Premier line items are built to scale. And because they're built to scale, they have a much more prototypical and realistic appearance. However, because Premier line items are built to scale and therefore larger, they typically require a wider radius curve in order to run correctly. So before you buy any Premier line item, always check the minimum curve requirement for that item and make sure that your layout meets those requirements. When it comes to details, a Premier line engine is going to be littered with all sorts of separately applied details as well as extra molded in details. And it's really in the details that the Premier line stands apart from the Railking line. If you look at this side frame on this Premier diesel, you can see there's much more detailing. There's separately applied brake lines, we've got separately applied sand lines back here, and even the molded in detail is much more advanced than on the Railking diesel. Moving on to the engine itself, you're also going to find lots of extra detailing. All these grab irons and steps here are all separately applied. These windshield wipers, these rear view mirrors, and these sand caps are also separately applied. Even the number boards on this engine are separately applied. There's a working door with a working latch. Down here on the pilot, there's holes in the steps for drainage. There's a coupler cut bar on the front, and behind this plow, there's even separately applied MU hoses. Towards the rear of the engine, on the fuel tank, we've got hand-painted fuel gauges and caps. Up on the fan, you've got the fan blades just like the Railking engine had, but you've also got separately applied piping up here. You got a nice fancy horn, and all of these grills here are separately applied and you can see through all of them. Even the paint job on this engine is more detailed than a Railking engine because all over it you've got these placards that have been applied. You've got a lot of warning placards back here, a whole bunch of stuff here, and you've even got a manufacturer's plate up here, and most of them are legible using a magnifying glass. When it comes to auxiliary features, you're going to see a lot more of them on a Premier engine than you'll typically see on a Railking engine. All Premier engines will have a smoke unit where applicable. They'll have extra lighting features such as ditch lights. This particular engine has them on the front and the back. You'll have marker lights when appropriate. You'll have lighted number boards, and you'll also have an interior cab light. So that pretty much sums it up in terms of the features that you're going to find on a Premier line item, and hopefully that gives you an idea of the differences between the Premier line and the Railking line. And while occasionally you will find some of these Premier line details on a Railking item, you can't count on it. Whereas when you buy a Premier line item, you know you're getting the best that MTH has to offer at the time the item was built. Everything I've just discussed also applies to rolling stock. Here I've got a Railking boxcar, and behind it is a Premier line boxcar. The Railking rolling stock typically is going to be smaller because it's not built to scale, and it's going to have less separately applied detailing. Whereas the Premier rolling stock will be larger because it is built to scale, and it will have a lot more separately applied detailing that'll give it a much more realistic and prototypical look. So that pretty much sums it up for this video. I hope you found this helpful, and I'll see you next time.